Krishnaswamy. I'm a senior fellow at ATREE, Bengaluru. It's a great pleasure and privilege to introduce Dr. Gita Sen for today's plenary. Dr. Gita Sen is currently the Director and Distinguished Professor, Ramalingaswamy Center on Equity and Social Determinants of Health, Public Health Foundation of India, Bangalore. She is the former chairperson of the Center for Public Policy at the Indian Institute of Management, Bangalore. She is also an adjunct professor of global health and population at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. She currently serves on the Gender and Rights Advisory Panel of WHO's Department of Reproductive Health and Research and was co-chair of Pan American Health Organization's Technical Advisory Group on Gender Equality and Health. She is a member of the UN's Independent Accountability Panel for Every Woman, Every Child, Every Adolescent. For over 3 decades, Dr. Gita Sen has worked on population policies, reproductive and sexual health, gender equality, and women's human rights, as well as issues of poverty, human development, and labor markets. Her work has helped shape the global paradigm shift on gender and development and on population and development. I now invite her to present her plenary, Health Inequalities, Should Ecologists Care? Welcome, Dr.
Thank you very much, Dr. Krishnaswamy. Just give me a thumbs up if I'm clear, audible, and so on.
You're very clear.
Okay, great. So thank you very much. And let me just say that I'm really pleased to be here with you. I'm sorry that I couldn't attend the 3 days of the AWS as much as I would have liked to, because I was caught in the middle of a training program of my own. But what bits and pieces I saw, and certainly looking at the compilation of all of the studies, made me very proud to be connected to ATREE. You guys and girls are doing terrific work. It just gets better and better every time. So take a bow. It's really good work. I was particularly, of course, excited to, and those were some of the sessions I could attend, some of the One Health approach work on zoonotics, which is really promising and is a great direction to be working in. I guess I could start, let me just put in a disclaimer for the title, which was thought up, I must admit, in a bit of a fevered moment, trying to figure out what title to give, and is probably a bit more flamboyant than the subject matter deserves. I think rather than sort of just pickily saying, should ecologists care? Well, of course, ecologists should care if they're normal human beings, if they're decent human beings, about health inequalities. But really, the more interesting and important question is, what insights can ecologists gain from thinking about or learning about, hearing about health inequalities? And it's some of that I'm going to be addressing. Now, of course, the problem of health inequalities has very much come to the fore in the context of the current COVID-19 pandemic. The one that we are all very familiar with is the huge inequality in access to vaccines across the global north and global south. I mean, that inequality is so obscene at this point that it sort of really hits you in the face. But it's not the only inequality. And in work that I am doing in relation to the pandemic, we keep uncovering more and more of the subtleties and nuances of different kinds and forms of inequality and the ways in which they impinge upon people's health, broadly speaking. And I'm going to come to some of those different kinds of inequality a little bit later. But just to give you one figure that's very striking. In the United States, and the last time I looked at this number, it was sometime around February, African-American death rates, male and female together, were a little more than double the death rates among whites. And that is not because African Americans are a much older population than whites are. In fact, they are a younger population because they tend to die off quicker than whites do. So for all the different reasons, that in itself should give us pause. But similar figures are true if you compare. If you set white death rates at 1, death rates for Hispanics, and I forget the numbers now, is something like 2.4, others around 2.7, etc. But the big chunk, of course, is the big population is the African-American population, and that is over double. Now that in the richest country in the world, in the country that has the greatest access to vaccines that we know of, is striking. And this is not because all of these other non-white populations are the anti-vaxxers, the people refusing to get vaccinated, etc. So it's a very striking figure that should give us pause. What is it that even in the presence of adequate supplies overall generates this kind of inequality in death rates? Now, I want to take you back a little bit to the antecedents of today's discussion. And I'm going to take you back to actually the early 1990s, possibly before some of you were born, where there were, in the lead-up preparation for UNCED in Rio 1992, there were huge tensions between environmentalists, mostly northern environmentalists, and women's organizations, mostly but not exclusively southern ones. And what these tensions were around population growth and population policies. Paul Ehrlich in the 1960s had written about a population bomb. There had been, family planning programs. Demographers have been running around saying, what is it? How can we strengthen family planning programs so that we can reduce population growth before the bomb explodes, etc. And it took some time for people to realize that this bomb had a color, that it was largely brown, black, and possibly yellow in its skin. And before people began to call out these theories for racism, sexism, etc., etc. But certainly Paul Ehrlich, a very respected Stanford biologist, kept purveying one version or the other of this argument at different points. And ironically, I think, someone who was much less convinced of the argument, and someone who I'm sure all of you as ecologists respect deeply, Edward Wilson, the father of, if one may assign parentage, of the idea of biodiversity itself. But when Wilson started straying into such things as sociobiology and so on, he, in a sense, was making arguments that began to sort of cohere with and integrate with what northern environmentalists in general were saying about limited carrying capacity, the need to really control population growth, etc. etc. I say this, I myself have a great deal of respect for at least, well, both of those people, but particularly for Wilson. And I was very proud of, once having been jointly interviewed with him for a radio program in those days of the early 1990s, when I spent some time at Harvard. Now, the problem now, and more sophisticated versions of these arguments took the form of, the early versions, and then the more, complex versions of the IPAT equation. Environmental impact is identically equal to population times GDP per capita times, a measure of technology, which is environmental impact per dollar or whatever of GDP. And the IPAT equation is really not an equation so much as an identity. And you can't make causal arguments from identities, was one of the arguments I remember that was going around at that time, because in an identity, you can literally put anything you want on both sides. And if it has some plausibility, it will obviously automatically be true. Anyway, all of this was very much in the air at that time. The big thing, of course, was that distributional questions were very poorly addressed. And this raised a whole set of concerns when one started thinking about population growth and population policies in those days. And those questions were, first of all, who is being left out of this discussion? Who is not at the table? And in a sense, something I learned at that time from being involved in these debates is that central questions in a field are very often shaped by the nature of inequalities. And they certainly were in that field of population at that time. And there, in a sense, I guess what I'm saying is that I learned that who is at the table, and women were not at the population table at that point. Who is at the table shapes and determines what is being discussed, why it is being discussed, and how it is being discussed. And for me, that has been a lesson that I've carried right through from those days of long ago in all of my work. Just a side note for you, at UNSED itself, the women's organizations finally had gotten their act together to say, these guys, don't know what on earth they're talking about. So we challenged the Northern environmental groups, and these were the big guys. Sierra Club, Audubon, you name it, they were all there, to a series of 5 days of debates and dialogues to hear different points of view. I think we made an impact because, in a sense, after UNSED, the chorus of population bomb from the Northern environmental groups actually was substantially muted. Population policies, as a result of women coming, forcing their way to the table, changed and transformed itself to a field that started paying much more attention to health, to girls' and women's empowerment, and to human rights. This is the famous paradigm shift of Cairo that, in a sense, followed a couple of years after ICPD. It opened up a whole new field of sexual and reproductive health and rights. that impacted on the way in which population policies were thought about. It actually changed the way in which even in India, we started thinking about population policies. Of course, nothing ever is set in stone, especially if it is a matter of huge inequalities and continuing inequalities. You sometimes have to keep reinventing the wheel, and I'm sure you might have questions about this, which we can come to later. The major fillip that all of this gave, the 3 or 4 years of this gave, was greater attention to distributional questions and to inequalities in general. Now, I've taken a little bit of time to traverse this history because I wanted to make 3 fundamental points. First, that social movements can and do shape history. Not always as they please, but they do shape history. Secondly, inequality determines who is at the table, even if you're an ecologist focusing on ants. That, of course, was Wilson's main work, as you well know. And thirdly, inequality shapes what questions are asked, why, and how. And just one quick last thing to close off this part of what I have to say is that when a person with a strong focus on the changed paradigm, who was also a demographer, produced India's population growth projections for this century, what they found was that up to, with 2100 as the end point, over 60%, close to actually 70% of population growth in this country in this century comes from something called population momentum. That is, it's the effect of the age base of the population that you have, which is related to previous growth. But what it means is that 60 to 70% is due to population momentum at this time. Then that's what we need to be focusing on. About 20% more was due to what they called unwanted fertility. That is, people who really wanted to control the numbers of children, but really didn't have access to good enough contraception, family planning, what have you. And only the remainder was the thing of people wanting lots and lots of children. I'm sure you may have questions about this, but the point is, when you look at it in this way, then if momentum is so important, what is it that can bring down momentum? You certainly cannot change the history of the population base that you have. The only way you can do it is by raising the age at which people start having children. So raising the age at marriage, and very closely connected to that, of course, is improving girls' access and presence in secondary and higher education, access to employment, etc. So it takes you in a very different direction than just saying that everybody's just, in UP and Bihar are just crazily having more children, bash them on the head, and you will reduce population growth. It won't have much of an effect, even in those 2 states. We can come back to that later. Let's fast forward from some of these insights then to health inequalities today and what lessons we can learn. And here I promised you that I would tell you about the different kinds of inequalities that we need to be looking at. So there's one cluster of evidence, and I'm going to just obviously only hand wave at this point. There's one cluster of evidence, that cluster 1, which is about resource inequalities. That is, differences at you can say between rich households and poor households. And there's quite a lot of work going back particularly to Michael Marmot's work in the UK, which found quite early that poor people and people living in poorer neighborhoods die, and in 2010, his number was die 7 years earlier. And there are persistent gaps over time. Professional men have a life expectancy of 80 years versus only about 73 for unskilled manual laborers. Furthermore, these are not threshold effects, but there's actually a gradient that gives longer life expectancy at every point in the gradient for those who are better off. In India, we know that 1/3 of our children under 5 are moderately or severely stunted. But half, that number is not 1/3, it's 50% in the poorest wealth quintile. That means, and that is twice as likely to be stunted as in the richest quintile. And stunting, as we know, or as you should know, is a huge problem with children today. And of course, as you would expect, it's 50% in Bihar versus 20% in Kerala and Goa, for example. There's work on between country inequality. I'm not going to bother with that right now. Second cluster of evidence is not about economic inequalities, which is what this first cluster is largely about. It's about social inequalities. And these are the inequalities by gender, caste, race and ethnicity, religion, disability, migrant status, and so on. Many of these inequalities are due to what you might call a society's original sins. In our context, I would say that our 2 original sins, and we are busy trying to make a third one, which I leave to your imagination, but the first 2 are, of course, caste and gender. And those inequalities play a huge role. These kinds of inequalities are, in a sense, the hardy perennial of health inequalities. And quite often, they lead, because these people are people who are not at the table. Their problems, the problems are not acknowledged. As with why are African Americans dying at such higher rates? The approaches are partial and misdirected. And furthermore, the intersectionality, how economic and social inequalities intersect and interact with each other, are really poorly recognized. This has outcomes for physical health, for mental health, etc. And the worst problem with these kinds of what I call the original sins is that they get completely normalized in society. The third cluster of inequalities, and now we start getting to things that you may not know that much about, and there is actually work that's been done by social epidemiologists in the health field, which says that people there are 2 things that come together either synergistically or they clash for everyone. One is life challenges. Who will I marry? What job will I get? What kind of, how will I spend my life, etc. versus capabilities. And those capabilities are innate capabilities of resilience, self-esteem, etc. Now you can see that when these 2 go together, everything works. When they're imbalanced, then you have what the social epidemiologists have called wear and tear on health, wear and tear on the individual system. It's the effect of rising aspirations and rising inequalities together. And it gives you a new dimension of thinking about what, in fact, our experience of the last 20 to 30 years has been. But what it then leads to is that people react to this in very different ways. And this is particularly because it's about aspirations, life challenges, and capabilities in the sense of the realities hitting against that. You get all kinds of millenarism, othering, blaming, feeling superior, etc. It's how these kinds of social factors start affecting population health. A fourth cluster began with alternative medicine, psychosomatic medicine, but now, and mind-body therapies and so on, but now has really started developing very, very strong scientific and evidence bases. And it has to do with what is, in a sense, what I don't have time to go into this, but it's the psychoneuroendocrinologic processes that lead to somatic symptom disorders. That is, the wear and tear in the system that we talked about earlier comes about because of chronic stress. And the chronic stress in the system is linked to different kinds of inequalities. So it's those same economic and social inequalities, but now actually we can see the pathways within the individual psychological, neurological, endocrinological systems. And women actually tend to be more prone to these than men. We don't quite know yet why, but they lead to all kinds of idiopathic somatic symptom disorders, pain, fatigue, weakness, anxiety, chronic depression, etc., as well as, interestingly, type A behaviors, toxic masculinities, and so on. Chronic stress alters the regulation of the endocrine system, the regulatory mechanisms of the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, the adrenaline glands, etc. It completely alters that. And a lot of really interesting and important evidence about the nature of inequalities as they get sort of hardwired into us, both physical and psychological and mental, is coming up. And the last cluster is, in a sense, one that where the surface has been scratched, but it has massive implications, and that is the epigenetic factors. Changes, epigenetic factors are those that are due to gene expression rather than the genetic code itself. So the work here is being done by reproductive biologists, and it points to huge numbers of inter and transgenerational effects. So that direct exposure, my direct exposure, leads to one set of, say an environmental toxin, may lead to one set of health problems for me. But if I'm pregnant, if I'm carrying a fetus, not only might I transfer these to the fetus, but I may also transfer them to the oocytes in the fetal ovaries, so that it goes into the third generation as well. What this does is that poor diet, toxic chemicals, all of the kinds of pollutants, and other things that we know about can start sort of jumping across and over generations. And as we know, Indians, huge diabetes problem. What is it? I mean, we're not exactly the most obese population in the world, and yet we have that. And that, in fact, is coming from these kinds of effects because of insults, nutritional insults in different generations. What does all of this tell us? Let me give a couple of conclusions. Inequality casts a very long shadow within societies over time on health and well-being. Status and I won't repeat. I find that some of my notes are about repeating. I've told you all of these: the economic inequality, the social inequalities, status inequalities, the psychoneuroendocrine systems, and then the epigenetic factors that work across generations. What does this tell us about health policy agendas? Obvious ones are to reduce inequality. Easier said than done, clearly. Especially in the time when we're seeing massive increases in economic inequality and a reduction in policy tools. But what we know now, for those who work in this field, is that inequality distorts policies by hiding and masking health problems, by blaming those who are at the bottom, whether they are poor or they are Black or they are Dalits or they are women or what have you, ignoring critical problems, such as, for instance, critical health system strengthening needs that we've known about for at least a decade and a half in the world, and which really, the pandemic comes and, slaps health systems into, and just crushes them because they're just completely unprepared. And it also reduces, and this is very important in health policy, inequality reduces solidarity. It reduces because those at the top, the distance starts becoming so much greater that you cannot wear the shoes of the other. You simply say, there, but for the grace of God, go I, and try and put it out of your mind. In a highly unequal society, there's one additional thing, and we've seen this in the country during the pandemic. Public health in a highly unequal society, public health measures can actually become draconian. They can turn themselves into an exercise in what Michel Foucault called biopower. If they don't pay specific attention to those at the bottom, for example, the well-known, infamous one of the lockdown's impact on migrant workers, overflowing grain stocks while people don't have food and are starving, very limited cash transfers, even though every economist, right, left, and center across the spectrum called for increasing the number of just straight cash transfers to people. It becomes difficult to address infrastructural question. It becomes difficult to do the things that one could do because, in fact, solidarity disappears in the system. So let me conclude by just coming back in a circle to the lessons for ecologists. I think I've made hopefully enough of, a thing for you to think about and begin perhaps thinking afresh. I know many of you, in fact, think about and worry about inequalities all the time, but there's many, many different ways in which inequalities work. But to see the ways in which inequalities not just work, but that they determine how we ask our questions, what we approve as evidence, and how we, in fact, examine that evidence and try and learn from it. Health, after all, as I know, and as we all know, is central to whether or how people survive or thrive. It's a prior for just about everything in life. And I'll end on a slightly humorous note. Last week, I broken a wisdom tooth at the height of the COVID wave. And of course, there's no question of going, and the wretched thing has sort of broken in the typical fashion teeth break, if you know what that is. Not the way you would want it. And of course, I couldn't go anywhere near a dentist. Well, finally, it chipped some more and it got, it had ragged, sharp edges. They were cutting inside. So I had to go to the dentist. But the 1.5 days before I sort of decided to figuratively bite the bullet and say, no, I'm going to die with this thing. I finally took the decision because literally that wretched tooth was making it impossible for me to do anything. Now, if that's what one little piece of, calcified bone can do, what happens to people who are living in chronic situations of stress and ill health? Their ability to literally be aware of and be able to do anything else is hugely impinged on and affected by health. We owe attention to inequalities, and we owe attention to good health for everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Sen. We now open up for questions. So the first question is by Prachi. How to move forward about our studies when we know its setting is unequal to begin with. Me being much more privileged and articulate with the ways in how I want to present the people I'm working with.
Listen, this is not about feeling, guilty. We all are whoever we are. We didn't ask, we won, wherever and however we were born. But we can do something about how we approach our research. And as I said, there are 2 or 3 things. One is, I never go wrong with Gandhiji's think about the poorest. And if what you are working on, what you're going to do, you're not taking into account what this means over there. Doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. I'm not saying don't ever do theoretical model building theories, etc. Because, I'm not saying that. I'm absolutely not in the direction of sort of, hard-headed, rigid rules, and definitely not about guilt. But think about the ways in which, till it becomes second nature to think in terms of, so is there an inequality angle here? One, in a question that you start working on. Or even as you've begun working on it, as you keep going, is there an inequality angle here? Secondly, what can I learn if there is an inequality angle? What can I suspect there may be one. What do I do? You will definitely learn more by bringing in the people who are at the bottom end of that inequality. Their insights, their approaches, their concerns, their knowledge can be crucial. Again, I'm obviously not talking about exploitative data mining of poor people here, but genuinely empathetic and responsive approaches to having questions shaped by them is crucial. Thirdly, making others, using your privilege to make others pay attention to what is being said, how it is being said, and being helpful and supportive. So the best ways you can use your privilege is to leverage it, in fact, in these ways. Not sure if that answers your question. I'm happy to continue if you have more.
Dr. Gita Sen, the next question is by Neeta. And so her question is, if you had to suggest 3 key takeaways on the approach to inequality for budding researchers, what would your advice be?
Well, I thought I already had, no? I've given you 1, 2, 3, so many different kinds of 1, 2, 3s. I think in a sense, I've already answered that in the previous question. Always, we live in a hugely unequal world. And it's unequal in so many different ways. As socially responsive ecologists in ATREE, I know that many of you are very aware of this when you're out in the field, when you're trying to think of, your research questions and how you will approach them, and how you will approach the people who you are looking at and thinking about. So I think I've already said it. Ask the inequality question. It's a straightforward, is there an inequality angle here of some kind that I'm not aware of? And if you have some doubts even if you don't have any doubts, especially I should say, if you don't have any doubts, you think you know it all, you know the inequality angle. When you're that certain, be sure to ask. Be sure to bring in the people about whom you think you know so much, and ask and really listen to what they have to say about what is important. Let me I'll give you an example, okay, from the COVID field. We all know about the famous PPEs, the head-to-toe covering that certainly all health workers spend their lives in these days. Who ever thought to ask women what kind of PPE would best suit their needs? Nobody. I'll give you the answer as well. Nobody. Finally, when somebody approached frontline health workers, 70% of whom are women, and asked them, well, frontline health workers, over 90% are women, and asked them, they said, oh God, we just hate it. And we hate it for the obvious biological reasons that you can't use the toilet, and if you're having your period, it's a nightmare. Now, if somebody had asked the women from the beginning, what would you want in this? They would have told you immediately, and they don't have to be fancy researchers. So that's what I mean by, everybody thinks they know, but they don't. why is it even till today in the US, just to tell you that these are problems across societies, we still don't have very good analysis of the reason for these kinds of African-American death rates. Some of it is due to weathering, or, there's different hypotheses, but these are surely things that should have been looked at from early on. Whereas in fact, they went with the thing of age. But anyway.
The next question is from Mridula. How would you speak to the new population policies currently being put in place, considered by certain state governments, example, in Uttar Pradesh and Assam, especially when it cuts across community and other caste intersections as well?
Yeah. Personally, I just think they're ridiculous. As I said, we keep having to reinvent the wheel. Both in UP and Bihar, which have some of the highest rates of fertility in the country, the rate has been falling and has been falling systematically. I gave you the numbers for population momentum and for unwanted fertility. We need to be barking up a different tree than the one that these guys are doing. We know the reasons that they are doing it, etc. But again, let me interject some levity into this one as well. Even funnier, I mean, I'm saying funny in a slightly, as you may have gathered, tongue-in-cheek manner, but genuinely funny is when Karnataka says the same thing, which it did. Some minister or the other said the same thing. And that's just ridiculous in Karnataka, because fertility in Karnataka is already well below replacement level. In fact, the first Yediyurappa government, someone had raised this same question. I think it was the chief minister himself. He had gone and made a visit to China and come back full of China's one child norm. That was the days when, China still had a one child policy. So he came back and said, oh, we must do the same thing in Karnataka. Absolutely, see, China has brought its fertility below replacement level, etc. And then, lots of people calling, phone calls galore, everybody saying, what do we do? What do we do? What do we do? I said, calm down. Even at that time, Karnataka's total fertility rate was below replacement level. It was 2.0. where 2.1 is the replacement TFR. I said, just feed that to whoever is the appropriate bureaucrat who can gently say, sir, actually, idu beda. My Malayalam is coming back now. Not necessary. We don't need this. And in fact, they did. And he shut up, quite now, of course, but again, as you saw, it was a one-day wonder. UP, Bihar, of course, it's a different story. Bihar is saying something else, but UP, of course, we know the reason it's happening. I think there's already enough pushback that has happened. And undoubtedly, we will hear more of it over the next few months, and then it will disappear. Because among other things, in addition, politically, very large numbers of the ruling party's own MLAs have 4 or 5 children. So they would all get disqualified in this process. So, a famous person said, the first time history repeats itself. First time it's tragedy, but now it's sort of definitely looking like farce.
Dr. Gita, I have a question.
Sure.
And this is about stunting, and we do have a significant part of our population, younger folk who have suffered from stunting, basically, which the attribution has been to both sanitation aspects as well as nutritional aspects. And while India has made a lot of strides, it is still, it only fulfills certain types of it's food security much more than nutritional security. And the protein deficiency and other deficiencies, nutritional deficiencies, still exist. So, is there anything that that are ideas that are there in terms of tweaking? In terms of also, this has implications for the type of crops we grow, and consumption of water, and the whole agroecological aspects also come in, also related to the overall One Health paradigm as well. So is there anything in terms of the policy space that we probably should be investing in or thinking about?
I think this is a really good question, and I think that this is definitely an area where One Health should go, because you can see the continuum from agroecology and the nature of crops to nutritional status and health. And then remember that all of this stunting is going to have epigenetic effects as well. We're not talking single generations here. And so if this generation of kids has substituted a far less nutritious cereal for the ragi or other things that they may, or millets that they may have been eating earlier, that's going to have epigenetic effects. And so I think it would be really interesting to see the links and the connections, to draw those, and to have a program that really looks at that would be really really valuable. I am not that familiar with work that actually makes those connections, but I can see the potential for somebody to explore the possibilities of those connections, and it would be very exciting work, I believe.
So it's been a pleasure and a privilege, Dr. Gita Sen, and we will draw this plenary session to an end. And thanks to everyone for being part of a very responsive audience and participation through questions. And we wish everybody happy and safe place wherever all of us are. And thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, and it's been really good talking to all of you. I wish we've all now got used to talking into the ether, so to speak. But luckily, I don't normally have to teach in this way. So otherwise, all those who teach say it's an absolute nightmare. You cannot see your students, you cannot see what they are thinking, doing, saying, nothing, etc. But we've all sort of gotten used to speaking into the ether and hearing our own voices. But in any case, it's been good to be here with you, and I hope I've left you with some food for thought. Thank you.